In August 1944, Adolf Hitler ordered the destruction of Paris. Every bridge, every monument, the Eiffel Tower, Notre-Dame, the Louvre. All of it was to be reduced to rubble and ash before the Allies could set foot in the City of Light. One man stood between that order and its execution. His name was Dietrich von Choltitz, a German general who had spent 4 years carrying out the Führer's commands without question. But in those final days of August, as American and French forces closed in on the French capital, Choltitz made a decision that would save one of the world's greatest cities from annihilation. The irony cuts deep. A career Wehrmacht officer, a man who had bombed Rotterdam and witnessed the liquidation of Jews at Sevastopol, became the unlikely savior of Paris. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. To understand what happened in Paris, you must first understand the man Hitler chose to defend it. Dietrich Hugo Hermann von Choltitz was born on November 9, 1894, in a castle in Silesia, in what is now Poland. His family had served Prussia for generations. Military service was not a career choice for the von Choltitz line. It was destiny written in blood and iron. His father was a Prussian army major. His uncle governed a regional district. The family owned forests and land. But their true inheritance was the Prussian military tradition, discipline, obedience, and service to the state above all else. In 1907, at age 13, young Dietrich enrolled in the Dresden Cadet School. By 1914, when the First World War erupted, he was already an officer candidate in the Royal Saxon Army's 8th Infantry Regiment. He was 20 years old when he first saw combat on the Western Front. He fought in the First Battle of the Marne, the bloodbath at Ypres, and the grinding horror of the Somme. He was promoted to lieutenant and made battalion adjutant within a year. By war's end, he had learned what every German officer of his generation learned, that wars are won not by heroes, but by men who follow orders, no matter the cost. The interwar years were lean. Germany's military was gutted by the Treaty of Versailles. But Choltitz stayed in the Reichswehr, the skeletal force permitted under the treaty. He became a cavalry captain in 1929, married the daughter of a general, and competed in riding competitions across Europe. He was a professional soldier in an army that barely existed. But when Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and began rearming Germany, Choltitz's fortunes rose. By 1937, he was a major commanding an infantry battalion. In 1938, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He participated in the occupation of Sudetenland that year, watching as Hitler's gamble paid off without a shot fired. The lesson was clear: boldness worked, weakness invited defeat. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Choltitz led his regiment into combat. His unit was transported by Junkers Ju-52 aircraft to an airfield near Łódź. During the Battle of the Bzura, he was wounded but captured 3,000 Polish soldiers and significant amounts of equipment. His superiors noted his competence and aggression. He was exactly the kind of officer the Wehrmacht needed. In May 1940, Choltitz's regiment took part in the invasion of the Netherlands. His battalion made an air landing at Valhaven Airfield outside Rotterdam and seized key bridges in the city. Dutch forces fought back from houses and strongpoints, inflicting casualties on the Germans. Choltitz's adjutant was killed, leading an assault. The situation grew desperate. German bombers appeared overhead, and despite Choltitz ordering red flares to signal friendly forces, the bombers struck anyway. Much of Rotterdam's center was destroyed. Over 800 civilians died. The bombardment broke Dutch resistance, and the Netherlands surrendered days later. Choltitz was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his actions. He had proven himself ruthless and effective. When his commanding officer, Kurt Student, was shot in the head by a sniper during surrender negotiations, German troops prepared to execute Dutch officers in reprisal. Choltitz intervened and stopped the massacre. It was an act of restraint that would later be cited as evidence of his humanity. But restraint is not the same as mercy, and Rotterdam still burned. In June 1941, Choltitz's regiment was stationed in Romania when Operation Barbarossa began. He advanced into Ukraine with Army Group South, crossing the Dnieper River by late August and reaching Crimea by October. His regiment joined the siege of Sevastopol, one of the bloodiest battles on the Eastern Front. The siege lasted from October 1941 to July 1942. Choltitz's regiment of 4,800 men was reduced to 349 by the time the city fell. The cold was murderous. Choltitz developed heart problems and chronic lung disease. But worse than the physical toll was what he witnessed. Sevastopol's Jewish population was systematically murdered by SS Einsatzgruppen. Choltitz later estimated that 36,000 Jews were shot. Years later, in captivity at Trent Park in England, secret recordings captured him admitting his role. "The worst job I ever carried out," he said, which, however, I carried out with great consistency, was the liquidation of the Jews. I carried out this thoroughly and entirely. Whether he personally ordered executions or merely witnessed them remains unclear. What is certain is that Choltitz knew he was complicit. He was a man who followed orders. By 1942, Choltitz was a general. He commanded the 261st Infantry Division, then the 11th Panzer Division. He fought at the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history. In March 1944, he was transferred to Italy, where he fought at Anzio and Monte Cassino. By June 1944, he was back on the Western Front, commanding the 84th Army Corps against the Allied breakout from Normandy. He was competent, experienced, and utterly loyal. On August 1, 1944, he was promoted to General of Infantry. On August 7th, Adolf Hitler personally appointed him military governor of Paris. Hitler had chosen Choltitz for a reason. The Führer was convinced that his generals were weak, that they had betrayed him after the failed July 20th assassination attempt. He needed a man who would obey without question. Choltitz seemed to be that man. When Choltitz arrived in Paris on August 8, 1944, he found a city on the edge of chaos. The Allied armies were closing in from Normandy. The French resistance was growing bolder. German forces were stretched thin, retreating eastward in disarray. Choltitz set up his headquarters in the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli, a luxury hotel overlooking the Tuileries Garden. He had only 20,000 troops under his command, many of them old men, boys, or conscripts from occupied territories. They were not enough to hold Paris against a determined assault. Choltitz knew this. He had seen what happened when German forces tried to hold cities against overwhelming odds. Stalingrad had become a graveyard. He did not intend Paris to become another. But Hitler's orders were clear. Paris was to be defended as a fortress. If it could not be held, it was to be destroyed. On August 15th, the Paris police went on strike. On August 19th, the French resistance rose up. Communist and Gaullist fighters seized government buildings, erected barricades of paving stones and overturned carts, and attacked German patrols. The uprising was spontaneous and chaotic, driven by 4 years of pent-up rage. Parisians had endured occupation, rationing, and humiliation. Now, with liberation within reach, they were determined to free themselves. Choltitz responded with force. German troops fired on barricades. Tanks rolled through the streets. But the city was too large, and his forces too few. The resistance controlled entire neighborhoods. On August 20th, Swedish consul Raoul Nordling brokered a fragile ceasefire. Choltitz agreed, hoping to buy time. But many resistance groups rejected the truce, and skirmishes continued. The situation was slipping out of control. On August 20th, Hitler sent his first explicit order. Paris was to suffer the widest destruction possible. Choltitz was to demolish power plants, waterworks, and bridges. On August 23rd, Hitler sent a cable that left no room for interpretation. Paris must not fall into the enemy's hand, except lying in complete debris. The Führer wanted the city leveled. Explosives were laid under bridges, including the centuries-old Pont Neuf and the ornate Pont Alexandre III. Charges were placed at industrial sites and monuments. Engineers prepared to blow the Eiffel Tower. Hitler's chief of operations, Alfred Jodl, called Choltitz personally to confirm the orders. The general was to destroy Paris and leave nothing but ruins for the Allies. It was a scorched earth policy taken to its logical extreme. Hitler had already issued the Nero Decree in March 1945, ordering the destruction of German infrastructure as the Allies advanced. Paris was simply an earlier test of that philosophy: deny the enemy everything, even if it meant annihilating one of Europe's greatest cities. Choltitz stalled. He told subordinates that the bridges were difficult to reach because of resistance fighters. He claimed his forces lacked the manpower to execute the demolitions under fire. But the truth was more complex. Choltitz had met Hitler in person weeks earlier at the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia. What he saw disturbed him. Hitler was a physical wreck: trembling hands, vacant stares, spittle-flecked rants about final victory and miracle weapons. Choltitz left that meeting convinced of two things. First, that Hitler was insane. Second, that Germany had already lost the war. To destroy Paris now served no military purpose. It was vindictive nihilism. Choltitz was a Prussian officer, trained to value discipline and obedience. But he was not a fanatic. He understood that orders must serve a rational, strategic goal. Destroying Paris would not stop the Allies. It would only guarantee his place in history as a war criminal. On August 22nd, Choltitz met with Swedish consul Raoul Nordling and Pierre Teitinger, the chairman of Paris's municipal council. They pleaded with him to spare the city. Nordling was a neutral diplomat with connections to both sides. Teitinger was a Frenchman who loved his city. They appealed to Choltitz's sense of history and culture. Paris was not just another city. It was a monument to Western civilization, art, literature, architecture, philosophy. To destroy it would be an act of barbarism that no future could forgive. Choltitz listened. He did not commit. But he allowed Nordling to send emissaries westward through the front lines to contact the Allies. The message was simple: come to Paris quickly, before it is too late. Meanwhile, the resistance continued to fight. Barricades multiplied across the city. Over 600 were erected, constructed from paving stones, sandbags, overturned vehicles, and felled trees. Resistance fighters, armed with rifles, pistols, and Molotov cocktails, defended them against German patrols. The prefecture of police, seized on August 19th, became a fortress. 2,000 police held it against 3 German tanks, repelling the assault with improvised explosives. Casualties mounted. According to French records, 901 members of the French forces of the interior and 582 civilians died during the uprising. The resistance could not defeat the Germans alone. They needed the Allies. On August 22nd, Allied commanders received word of the uprising. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had not planned to liberate Paris. His strategy was to encircle the city, cut off German supply lines, and push eastward toward Germany. Liberating Paris would require resources: food, fuel, engineers, and time. Eisenhower calculated that feeding the city would consume 4,000 tons of supplies per day, supplies needed elsewhere. But Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, was adamant. France could not allow its capital to be destroyed. The resistance was fighting and dying. To abandon them would hand the Communists a propaganda victory and allow the resistance to claim they had liberated Paris without Allied help. De Gaulle pressured Eisenhower relentlessly. He threatened to detach the French 2nd Armored Division and send it to Paris alone, bypassing the Allied chain of command. On August 22nd, Eisenhower relented. He ordered the 2nd Armored Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, to advance on Paris. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division would follow in support. On August 24th, Leclerc's vanguard, the 9th Company of the Régiment de Marche du Tchad, broke through German lines and entered Paris from the south. The company was nicknamed La Neuve, the Nine, because 146 of its 160 men were Spanish Republicans who had fled Franco's dictatorship. They fought for France because they had no country left to fight for. Captain Raymond Dron led them through the Porte d'Italie and reached the Hôtel de Ville at 9:22 p.m. Church bells rang across the city. Parisians poured into the streets, singing the Marseillaise and embracing the soldiers. It was a moment of pure euphoria, but the battle was not over. On the morning of August 25th, the full weight of the 2nd Armored Division and the U.S. 4th Infantry Division entered Paris. German strongpoints resisted. Tanks exchanged fire in the streets. Snipers fired from rooftops. At the Hôtel Meurice, Choltitz waited. French tanks surrounded the building. At 3:30 p.m., Choltitz signed the surrender. He was escorted to the Prefecture of Police, where he signed the formal capitulation, and then to the Gare Montparnasse, where General Leclerc had established his headquarters. The German garrison in Paris, numbering over 20,000 men, laid down its arms. Choltitz had ordered his troops not to resist. The explosives under the bridges were never detonated. The Eiffel Tower stood intact. Paris was liberated. The casualties were significant, but not catastrophic. The French resistance lost 1,600 dead. Leclerc's division suffered 130 killed and 319 wounded. German losses were approximately 3,200 dead and 12,800 captured. Paris had been spared the fate of Warsaw, which Hitler was simultaneously ordering the Wehrmacht to obliterate in response to the Polish uprising. The contrast was stark. In Warsaw, the SS and Wehrmacht systematically destroyed entire districts, killing over 200,000 civilians. In Paris, Choltitz chose restraint. Why did he do it? Choltitz later claimed it was conscience, culture, and sanity. In his 1951 memoir, he portrayed himself as a cultured officer who loved Paris and refused to destroy it out of moral conviction. He claimed that Hitler was insane and that the order was militarily pointless. This narrative became the basis for the 1965 book and 1966 film Is Paris Burning?, which depicted Choltitz as a hero who saved the city through an act of defiant courage. The story was compelling, but it was also incomplete. Historians now know that Choltitz's decision was more pragmatic than heroic. He lacked the troops to defend Paris effectively. The resistance controlled much of the city. Allied forces were hours away. Destroying Paris would not stop the Allies. It would only ensure his execution as a war criminal after the war. Choltitz was not a saint. He was a calculating officer who understood that obedience to a suicidal order served no purpose. His past complicates the narrative further. The Trent Park recordings reveal a man complicit in atrocities. His admission about the liquidation of Jews, his knowledge of massacres at Sevastopol, these were not the words of a man driven by conscience. They were the words of a soldier who had done terrible things and justified them as following orders. Choltitz saved Paris not because he was morally superior, but because the circumstances allowed him to make a rational choice. He chose survival and pragmatism over fanaticism and destruction. In that moment, it was enough. Charles de Gaulle entered Paris on August 25th and delivered a speech at the Hôtel de Ville. He proclaimed that Paris had liberated itself, deliberately downplaying the American role and emphasizing French agency. On August 26th, he led a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées from the Arc de Triomphe to Notre-Dame. 2 million Parisians lined the streets. German snipers still fired from rooftops, and the crowd scattered for cover more than once. But the moment was transcendent. France was free. Paris was alive. The war would continue for another 9 months, but the liberation of Paris marked a symbolic turning point. It proved that the Nazi Empire was collapsing. Choltitz spent the rest of the war in Allied captivity, first at Trent Park in England, then at Camp Clinton in Mississippi. He was never charged with war crimes, though the Trent Park recordings suggest he should have been. After the war, he returned to Germany and lived quietly in Baden-Baden until his death in 1966. French officers attended his funeral. He was remembered, officially, as the man who saved Paris. The truth is more ambiguous. Choltitz was a career officer who spent most of his life following orders, including orders to commit atrocities. In August 1944, he found himself in a position where following orders meant annihilating a city for no strategic gain. He chose not to follow that order. It was not an act of heroism. It was an act of sanity. But in a war defined by fanaticism and nihilistic violence, sanity was rare enough to be remarkable. Choltitz did not save Paris because he was a good man. He saved it because he was not quite bad enough to destroy it. The legacy of Paris's liberation is layered with irony. A Nazi general refused to carry out an atrocity, not out of morality, but out of pragmatism. A city was saved not by grand strategy, but by the chaos of an uprising that forced the Allies' hand. A moment of liberation was achieved by Spanish exiles fighting for a France that had once betrayed them, by American soldiers who had no intention of entering the city, and by resistance fighters who paid in blood for their freedom. History does not offer clean narratives. It offers moments where individuals, caught between ideology and reality, make choices. Choltitz's choice preserved a city. It did not redeem his past. But it ensured that future generations would walk the streets of Paris, cross its bridges, and gaze up at the Eiffel Tower, unaware of how close they came to inheriting only ruins. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Word count, 4,007 words.